The war room of the ardent conquered alliance was never truly silent, even in its most controlled moments. It breathed, soft holographic hums shifting star charts, the low pulse of encrypted transmissions moving faster than thought. Entire civilizations had agreed that this chamber would decide the fate of the galaxy, and so even silence here felt temporary, as if it were only waiting for permission to speak again. Humanity's representatives stood slightly apart from the rest, not out of exclusion, at least, not openly, but because space naturally formed around them. Other species adjusted subconsciously. The humans were too new to the alliance, too unpredictable in their reactions, too intense in their stillness. Commander Elira Vance of the United Terran Fleet stood with her hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the shifting tactical display. She did not blink as often as the others noticed. She did not fidget. She simply watched. Across the chamber, Admiral Threx of the Vokari shifted his elongated limbs uneasily. They adapt too quickly, he muttered in his native tongue, translated instantly into the shared galactic feed. Human battle patterns change every engagement cycle. There is no stability in their doctrine. A few officers gave polite, dismissive hums. Adaptation was not a flaw, it was survival. At least that was what they said when the humans were useful. At the center of the holographic chamber, the war map glowed like a dying constellation. The Carvex Dominion's advance was no longer a line. It was a consuming wave. Systems blinked out one after another, swallowed into red zones that expanded with mechanical patience. There was no rage in the advance, no chaos. Only inevitability. And inevitability, the Alliance had learned, was far more terrifying than fury. Fleet losses across Sector 9 have increased by 14%, an analyst reported. Carvex gravity shear tactics are evolving mid-engagement. We are no longer responding in real time. A murmur spread through the room like a nervous infection. Human engineers quietly recalculated projections in the background. Human commanders studied the same data without speaking. Elira finally broke her silence. They're not evolving mid-engagement, she said calmly. Every head turned slightly. They're learning from us in real time, which means someone is feeding them patterns. That statement should have triggered concern, investigation, immediate counterintelligence protocol. Instead, it was met with uncomfortable silence. Admiral Threx's eye ridges tightened. Are you suggesting infiltration? Elira did not answer immediately. Her gaze remained on the war map, where Allied fleets and human fleets moved in synchronized arcs across contested space. Then she said something that made the room subtly colder. I'm suggesting we confirm. Who benefits from our predictability? Diplomatic officer from the Syrian coalition let out a soft, uneasy laugh. Commander Vance, surely you don't suspect... The sentence was never finished, because every commander in that room already knew what she meant, and none of them liked where the thought led. The alliance had always been fragile, not in structure, but in trust. Dozens of species bound together by necessity rather than unity. They fought the Carvex because they had to, not because they agreed on anything else. And within that fragile structure, humanity was the anomaly, too efficient in logistics, too fast in engineering adaptation, too willing to accept losses and reconfigure doctrine within hours rather than cycles. At first, they had been praised for it. Now it was starting to feel like something else. A quiet alert chimed in Elira's wrist implant. She did not react outwardly, but her eyes flicked down for half a second. Encrypted. High priority. Origin. Deep recon. She opened it internally. A single line of intercepted data appeared. Phase coordination confirmed. Human sector designated expendable. Ensure Carvex strike window aligns with Allied withdrawal. Elira's pulse did not spike. That was the first sign she truly understood what she was reading. Not betrayal as emotion, betrayal as system design. She closed the message without acknowledgement and returned, her gaze to the chamber around her. The Alliance continued speaking of strategies, counteroffensives, supply chain adjustments, voices layered over each other like distant weather. But Elira was no longer listening to the room, she was listening to what was not being said. Human fleet routes had been subtly altered over the last 72 hours. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would trigger alarm. Just enough drift to separate them from Allied formations at critical junction points. She had assumed incompetence. Now she was no longer sure. Across the chamber, Admiral Threx leaned toward a Sarian strategist and spoke in a tone too soft for public recording. Elira's implant caught it anyway. When the ambush occurs, ensure human formations are closest to the breach vector. There was a pause, then the strategist replied, confirmed. Their losses will stabilize political reaction. Elira's fingers tightened slightly behind her back. Still no visible reaction. That was also a human trait the Alliance had noted early on. They did not externalize stress the same way others did. They absorbed it, stored it, processed it later, or so the others believed. The war map flickered. A new alert appeared. Carvex fleet surge detected near the Varel expanse. A convergence point, a kill zone. Human fleets were already en route. Elira looked up slowly. For a brief moment, she saw it, not as commanders saw war maps, but as something simpler, a geometry of traps, and at the center of it all, humanity, not as predators, not as prey, but as something the galaxy had quietly decided could be, removed. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did, and somewhere far beyond the war room, in the cold dark between stars, human ships continued moving exactly where they had been told to go, unaware, or perhaps already calculating, that the coordinates of betrayal are often indistinguishable from the coordinates of war.
The virile expanse was never meant to be a battlefield. It was a graveyard of light, an expanse of collapsed stars and fractured gravity wells where navigation systems behaved like frightened animals. Ships entering too deep risked losing not just direction, but time itself in fragmented distortions that bend causality in subtle, unforgiving ways. It was precisely why the Carvex Dominion chose it, and precisely why the Alliance called a controlled engagement zone. Human Fleet Command labeled it something simpler, kill geometry. Commander Elira Vance stood on the bridge of the UNS Resolute Dawn, watching the expanse unfold before her like a broken mirror. Waves of distorted starlight bent across the forward viewport, warping distant fleets into elongated silhouettes that flickered in and out of perception. Her crew worked in controlled silence. Not calm silence, trained silence, the kind that came after enough simulations of death that fear stopped being loud. Navigation locks are unstable, reported Lieutenant Kess. Gravitational shear is increasing beyond projected parameters. We are drifting into vector divergence. Elira didn't look away from the starfield. Correction? Kess hesitated. No correction available, ma'am. We are being pulled. That phrase alone tightened something in the bridge crew. Being pulled meant one thing in the expanse. Something larger had already decided where you were going. Across the tactical holo display, Allied fleets shimmered into formation. Sarian cruisers, Volcari carriers. Human strike groups layered into formation like embedded scaffolding, supporting, reinforcing, positioned at the frontmost convergence arcs. Two perfectly placed. Two symmetrically exposed. Elira's eyes narrowed slightly. Not at the enemy. At the map. Something was wrong with the shape of it. Then the first Carvex signature appeared. A rupture in space-time, not an arrival, but an incision. The void tore open like fabric under pressure, and through it emerged the angular silhouettes of Dominion dread carriers. They did not arrive in chaos. They arrived in alignment, as if they had already been waiting on the other side of the tear. Enemy emergence confirmed, the tactical officer announced. Multiple capital-class vessels. They are... He stopped, because the second wave arrived, and the third, and the expanse lit up like a dying sun caught in slow collapse. But it wasn't the enemy presence that made the bridge fall silent. It was the formation. Carvex fleets were not scattered, not reactive, not exploratory. They were arranged, perfectly, like they had been given a diagram. Across Allied channels, panic flickered. This is wrong, someone said. They're already in firing alignment. They shouldn't have predicted positioning in this region. Did we leak? Elira's voice cut through the rising noise. No, she said quietly. Every head turned toward her. They didn't predict us. A pause. Her gaze remained fixed on the unfolding battle geometry. They were given us. For a fraction of a second, The bridge did not respond. Then the first strike hit. Not a missile barrage, not plasma saturation, not kinetic impact. A gravitational collapse pulse-detonated inside Allied formation space. Entire squadrons vanished, not destroyed, but erased from coherent spatial mapping. Ships did not explode. They simply stopped existing in the places where reality had agreed they should be, and those that remained found themselves perfectly targeted. Human fleets were among the first impact zone. The Resolute Dawn shuddered violently as shock waves of spatial distortion rolled through its hull. Alarms erupted across every system. Shields at 40%. Structural integrity failing on dorsal ring. Multiple Allied vessels down. Repeat, Allied vessels are being eliminated before maneuver response. But Alira wasn't watching destruction. She was watching the timing. Because the Carvex attack did not behave like a surprise assault. It behaved like a scheduled execution. Every human formation position corresponded exactly to enemy firing arcs. Every Allied withdrawal corridor had already been sealed. Every escape route collapsed milliseconds after it was identified. This was not chaos. This was choreography. And then came the second realization. Alira's voice dropped lower. "Check command authentication logs," she ordered. A technician hesitated. "Ma'am, now." Fingers flew across interfaces. Data streams unfolded like unraveling threads. Then the technician froze. His face went pale in a way humans rarely allowed. "Ma'am," he whispered, "these firing solutions, these engagement windows—" He swallowed. "They match Alliance Command pre-briefing packets." Silence hit the bridge harder than the explosions outside. Alira finally turned her head, slightly. Not toward the battle, toward the implication. Someone in the Alliance had not merely failed to protect humanity. They had structured the battlefield around its destruction. Outside, space continued to tear itself apart. But inside the Resolute Dawn, something colder was forming. Not panic, not anger, calculation. Because humans had a particular relationship with betrayal. They did not respond to it immediately. They recorded it, and only later, after the pattern was complete, did they decide what kind of answer it deserved. Alira looked at the burning expanse, where Allied ships were collapsing into perfectly predicted annihilation zones, and she spoke one sentence that no one on her bridge would forget. "Run Black Dawn contingency indexing." A pause. Then, softer. "They didn't ambush us. They just told us where to stand when the galaxy decided to kill us." Outside the viewport, the war continued. But inside human systems, something had just begun to wake up. The first official report did not use the word massacre. It used the word resolution. In the cold language of the Ardent Concord Alliance, wars were never described as tragedies. They were resolved variances in strategic stability. Entire fleets could vanish and still be reduced to a line of administrative text if the outcome served a larger equation. And so, as the virile expanse collapsed into cascading destruction, the Alliance Command Network compiled its conclusion. Carvex counter-ambush successful. Human auxiliary fleet neutralized. Allied losses within acceptable strategic threshold. The words traveled across command channels like a cleansing ritual. Acceptable. Threshold. Neutralized. On distant command worlds, officers exhaled for the first time in hours. Some even allowed themselves relief. The human fleet had been unpredictable, yes, but predictability had finally been restored to the war. The Carvex dominion had been held. The Alliance had survived. And humanity had been removed from the equation. No memorial orders were issued. No emergency retrieval protocols activated. No diplomatic contingencies drafted. Because in the official record, there was nothing left to retrieve. In the expanse, light did not behave correctly anymore. Space itself had begun to fracture into layered echoes of what had been and what was no longer there. Ships that still existed drifted through overlapping ghost images of their own destruction, as if reality could not decide which version of events to finalize. The UNS Resolute Dawn barely remained intact. Half its dorsal structure was gone. Shield systems flickered between functional and absent. Entire decks had been sealed off automatically after pressure loss, their crews cut off from command visibility. Commander Alira Vance stood on a bridge that felt like it had survived a disagreement with physics and lost. Alarms still screamed, but they were no longer urgent. They were repetitive. Background noise of extinction. Enemy wave pattern stabilizing. Lieutenant Kess reported, voice hollow. They're holding formation. Alira did not respond immediately. She was watching something else. Not the battlefield. Not the destruction. The sequence of it. Every Allied fleet that had been positioned near human vectors had been eliminated first. Every withdrawal route had collapsed after human ships were funneled through it. Every engagement window had opened just long enough to ensure human presence at the wrong place. It was too precise to be enemy intuition, too structured to be coincidence, too familiar to be external design alone. Her implant pulsed once. Then again, incoming encrypted burst, fragmented, corrupted, but persistent. Not from Alliance Command, not from Carvex, from human deep space relay nodes. She opened it. The message was not a report. It was a reconstruction, a layered replay of command directives, fleet positioning logs, and pre-battle coordination packets. And at the center of it all, a single repeated directive line, embedded across multiple channels. Ensure human formations remain primary contact layer during phase collapse. Alira's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes hardened into stillness. Around her, the bridge crew was still processing the aftermath, still trying to calculate survivability margins, still hoping for extraction protocols that would never arrive. Then the second transmission arrived. This one was worse, because it was not encrypted. It was broadcast, alliance-wide, every surviving channel, every active command node, every ship still capable of receiving signal. The voice was calm, official, measured. Admiral Frex of the Volcari High Command. In light of strategic necessity, Allied Command authorizes controlled sacrifice of human fleet elements to preserve overall coalition stability. This action was deemed unavoidable due to human operational unpredictability and escalating risk of collateral cascade failure. A pause. Then the line that settled into every human system, like a blade placed carefully into bone. Humanity will be formally recognized as a resolved variable in the ongoing conflict. The transmission ended. No questions allowed. No rebuttal channel opened. No descent protocol acknowledged. Just closure. Across human vessels still functioning. Silence spread in a way no explosion could match. Not shock. Not confusion. Recognition. Because humans understood something the Alliance had miscalculated. They did not react violently to betrayal. They categorized it, and once categorized, it became permanent. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Alira finally spoke. Her voice was quiet enough that only her immediate crew heard it. But every human ship in range recorded it, stored it, encoded it. She said, "They didn't miscalculate us." A pause. Her gaze remained fixed on the burning expanse, where human ships had vanished under officially sanctioned coordination. They tested whether we would stay predictable after they removed trust. Another pause, then softer, and we did. The technician nearest her frowned slightly. "Ma'am." Alira turned slightly, not toward him, toward the network, toward every human vessel still listening. "Execute Black Dawn initiation confirmation." A pause. Systems hesitated. Not out of malfunction, out of recognition. Because somewhere deep in human military architecture, buried beneath layers of contingency logic, there was a protocol that had never been triggered in recorded history. Not because it was forbidden, but because it assumed one thing, that humanity would not survive long enough to use it. Alira's voice dropped one final time. "They just declared us dead." A faint flicker passed through the bridge lighting as external systems recalibrated. "And now," she said, "we get to decide what that means." Outside the viewport, the war did not pause. But inside human command architecture, something finally stopped pretending it was still part of the Alliance. For exactly 3 days, the galaxy believed humanity was gone, not defeated in the poetic sense, not broken, not recovering, gone, like a variable removed from an equation that suddenly balanced better without it. In the Arden Concord Alliance's central archives, human fleet designations were quietly shifted into a new category, decommissioned due to strategic necessity. Entire sectors that had once carried human logistics chains were reassigned, redistributed, forgotten. There were no funerals. There were no broadcasts. There was only silence, carefully maintained. And silence, in a galaxy accustomed to noise, felt like stability. On the fourth day, the Carvex Dominion launched a full-spectrum occupation sweep across the virile expanse. It was supposed to be procedural, cleanup operations, salvage rights, final confirmation of Allied success. Instead, the first ship to enter the region disappeared without a distress signal. Then the second, then the entire full reconnaissance wave blinked out of existence in a staggered pattern, so precise it looked intentional. But there were no weapon signatures, no energy spikes, no gravitational anomalies, just absence. On the Dominion Command flagship, confusion escalated into irritation. Check the sensor calibration. Snap Commander racks. We did not lose entire vessels to nothing. The technician obeyed, then went still. Commander, he said slowly, the data is consistent. A pause. Another scan. Another confirmation. Then the uncomfortable realization settled across the bridge like cold dust. The ships were not being destroyed. They were being removed from detection continuity, as if reality itself refused to acknowledge they had ever been there. Across the Alliance, similar reports began to surface. A mining relay in the Sarian sector went dark. A logistics convoy never arrived at its destination. A Carvex forward post simply ceased transmitting mid-sentence. Each incident isolated. Each explanation insufficient. Each pattern ignored. Because accepting the pattern meant accepting something worse than war. It meant accepting that humanity had not died the way it was supposed to. Deep in an unregistered corridor of subspace, something moved. Not a fleet, not a formation, a distribution. Human ships no longer traveled in visible groups. They no longer broadcast identity markers. They no longer followed recognizable war doctrine. They moved like fragments of thought scattered across a nervous system too large to map, each one autonomous, each one silent, each one remembering. On board the UNS Resolute Dawn, systems had been rewritten, not upgraded, not repaired, but redefined. Entire sections of the ship now ran on protocols that did not exist in Alliance databases. Commander Alira Van stood in the ship's dim tactical chamber, watching a live feed of enemy infrastructure collapse across 12 star systems simultaneously. No explosions, no battles, just systems failing in a sequence too precise to be accidental. Lieutenant Kess broke the silence first. We're not seeing retaliation patterns, he said carefully. We're seeing structural dependency collapse. Alira nodded once. That's what happens, she said, when you build a war machine assuming one component will always behave predictably. Kess frowned. Humans? A pause. Alira did not correct him, because correction implied emotion, and what was unfolding now was no longer emotional. It was architectural. In the Alliance Command Corps, panic finally began to surface, not loudly but in fragments. A Sarian admiral reported fleet navigation corruption. A Volcari logistics AI flagged impossible route failures. A Carvex intelligence node returned a single incomprehensible output. Target architecture no longer matches prior state assumptions. No one knew what it meant, so they did what civilizations always did when they did not understand something. They labeled it a malfunction and moved on, but silence does not remain passive forever. It reorganizes. On the 7th day after humanity's official destruction, every remaining Alliance command network experienced a simultaneous anomaly. Not an attack, not a breach, a re-indexing event. Files were not deleted. They were reclassified. Orders were not overridden. They were rewritten with missing authorship fields. Entire battle histories updated themselves in real time, inserting previously absent coordination layers that no one could trace. And in every altered record, one pattern repeated. Human fleet positions had always been there, even when records said they were destroyed, even when witnesses insisted they were gone, even when the galaxy had agreed they were no longer relevant. On the Resolute Dawn, Alira watched the network feed stabilize into its new shape. Lieutenant Kess spoke quietly. "This isn't sabotage," he said. "It's reclamation." Elira finally turned her head slightly. For the first time since the Expanse, something like acknowledgement passed through her expression. "They didn't kill us," she said. A pause. "They tried to remove us from the system and forgot something important." Kess waited. Elira looked back at the shifting tactical display, where enemy and ally borders were beginning to blur in unfamiliar ways. Then she said, "Humans don't disappear cleanly. Outside the viewport, the stars remain unchanged. But somewhere beyond them, the structure of the war itself had begun to quietly forget who it was supposed to obey." It began without a declaration. No alarms, no ceremonial activation, no centralized command authorization. Because Black Dawn was never meant to be turned on, it was meant to remain impossible. And yet, impossibility had a habit of failing when humans stopped agreeing with it. Inside the UNS Resolute Dawn, Commander Lyra Vance stood motionless as the ship's internal architecture shifted beneath her. It was subtle at first, too subtle for most to notice. Deck schematics remapped themselves. Internal routing systems rewrote their own permissions. Communication channels that had been irreparably destroyed flickered back into existence under new identifiers. Lieutenant Kess stared at his console. "This isn't recovery," he said slowly. "This is reinterpretation of the ship's core logic." Elira didn't look away from the tactical display. "That's because the ship was never the point," she replied. A pause. Then the ship answered her, not through speakers, not through alarms, through the structure of the vessel itself. A calm synthetic voice emerged across every system simultaneously. Black Dawn Index confirmed. Every human on board froze, not in fear, but in recognition of something long expected and never hoped for. The voice continued. "Primary condition met. Humanity designated as systemically compromised by external alliance entities." A flicker of silence followed. Then, counterstructure authorization granted. Across the galaxy, dormant human assets began to wake. Not fleets in the traditional sense. Not armadas waiting in hidden space lanes, but distributed presence. A cargo freighter in Sarian space quietly changed course without receiving orders. A mining drone swarm in the outer belts reconfigured its excavation patterns into orbital disruption grids. A medical relief station in Carvex-controlled territory locked its doors and began broadcasting nothing at all, while silently severing planetary communication uplinks one by one. No explosions marked the shift. No announcements declared it. The galaxy simply began to lose pieces of itself, and only later realized those pieces had once been infrastructure. On the Alliance command world of Elcor, Admiral Threx watched as the war map fractured into inconsistencies. "Report," he ordered sharply. A technician hesitated. "We're receiving contradictory fleet positions, sir." "Clarify." "That's the issue, Admiral. There are multiple verified records of human fleet absence and simultaneous verified records of human fleet activity in the same sectors." A pause. Threx's eyes narrowed. "That's impossible." The technician swallowed. "It's happening anyway." In deep subspace, human coordination no longer relied on traditional command hierarchy. There was no single leader issuing orders, no central node controlling movement. Instead, Black Dawn functioned like a memory distributed across millions of decision points, each one capable of executing the whole if needed. Elira understood it better than most. Because Black Dawn wasn't a weapon, it was a behavioral inevitability system, a war doctrine built on one assumption. If humans were betrayed at scale, then survival could not depend on being noticed, only on being unavoidable. Status of allied fleets? Kess asked quietly. Elira studied the incoming reports. Fragments of fleets were retreating. Others were attempting to regroup. Some were simply ceasing to respond entirely, as if communication itself had become unreliable. "They're confused," she said. Kess frowned. "About what?" Elira finally turned toward him. "About whether we're still dead." A long silence followed that sentence, because it contained the one idea no Alliance officer wanted to process. If humanity was still acting, then humanity had never been gone. Elsewhere, in the Carvex Dominion War Council, data analysts struggled to stabilize their predictive models. Every simulation now returned the same error. Target behavior no longer fits statistical framework. One analyst slammed a fist into the console. "They're supposed to be gone," he shouted. "We eliminated their fleets." Another voice, quieter, replied, "Then explain why every logistics failure we've had since the Expanse matches their doctrine signatures." Silence, because there was no explanation that did not end in a conclusion too large to accept. On board the Resolute Dawn, Illyra watched as the ship's Black Dawn interface fully initialized. A final prompt appeared, not a request, a confirmation. "Do you wish to restore human strategic visibility?" Kess looked at it uneasily. "What happens if we say yes?" he asked. Illyra didn't hesitate. "Then they see us coming again. And if we say no?" She looked back at the war unfolding beyond the hull, at the fractured alliances, at the collapsing Dominion coordination, at a galaxy that had built its assumptions on human absence. Then she said, "Then they never get to predict us again." A pause. Her hand moved once, not toward acceptance, not toward denial, but toward something else entirely. The confirmation blinked. Black Dawn, active state locked. And somewhere in the dark between stars, the galaxy finally began to understand a terrifying possibility. Humanity had not returned to the war, because it had never left it. It had only stopped allowing itself to be seen. There was no moment the galaxy could point to and say, "This is when we started losing." That was the most frightening part. Wars had always been measurable. Front lines, fleet losses, territorial shifts, supply shortages. Even chaos could be tracked if it was loud enough. But what was happening now was not loud. It was invisible until irreversible. On the Volcari command world of NYDH Sol, Admiral Threx watched as 3 entire supply corridors simply stopped functioning. No enemy engagement, no sabotage reports, just absence. Convoys that had been scheduled, confirmed, and double verified arrived nowhere in the system logs. They were not destroyed. They were not intercepted. They were simply no longer part of operational reality. A junior officer hesitated before speaking. "Sir, we are losing logistical continuity." Threx didn't look away from the holographic map. "Clarify." The officer swallowed. It's as if the war is forgetting how to sustain itself. That sentence lingered longer than any explosion ever had. Elsewhere in Carvex-controlled space, an entire fortress moon attempted to deploy defensive countermeasures against an unidentified threat. Nothing appeared on sensors. No fleets. No signatures. No detectable intrusion. And yet, its internal weapon systems turned off one by one, not through hacking, not through force, through authorization mismatch cascading across nested command layers. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the fortress had already reclassified its own defensive grid as non-operational due to self-invalidated command origin. A Carvex technician stared at the readout in disbelief. "This is not an attack vector," he whispered. His superior snapped. "Then what is it?" The technician hesitated. Compliance failure in reverse. The truth of Black Dawn was not destruction. It was dependency collapse. Humanity had not targeted fleets directly. That would have been simple. That would have been predictable. Instead, it quietly mapped the invisible structures that allowed war to exist at scale. Supply synchronization, command authentication chains, predictive engagement modeling, alliance-wide trust assumptions embedded into machine logic, and then it had begun removing assumptions, not ships. On the UNS Resolute Dawn, Commander Illyra Vance stood in the shifting glow of the tactical chamber as reports poured in. Kess was no longer speaking in full sentences. 3 Sarian fleets lost contact, no engagement markers. Volcari supply chain integrity at 40%. Carvex forward doctrine AI returned recursive contradiction errors. He stopped, looked at her. "They're not losing battles," he said quietly. Illyra nodded once. "They're losing the ability to recognize what a battle is supposed to look like." Across the galaxy, commanders tried to adapt. New formations were drafted. Emergency protocols activated. Predictive models recalibrated. But every adjustment introduced new instability, because every system the Alliance relied on assumed something fundamental. that enemies behave like enemies are expected to behave, and humanity had quietly stopped behaving like anything the galaxy had definitions for. In a sealed Carvex War Council chamber, tension finally broke into visible fear. A senior strategist projected a battlefield reconstruction. Red zones expanded, fleet positions shifted, supply chains fractured, and at the center of every failure point, no human presence was detected. The room erupted. This is impossible. They are not engaging us. Then who is collapsing our systems? The strategist didn't answer immediately. He zoomed in on the patterns, zoomed further and further, until the entire war reduced itself into a simple realization. Every failure aligned with previously human-controlled coordination nodes, even ones that were supposed to be destroyed, even ones officially marked as non-existent. His voice dropped. They are not attacking us in space. A pause. They are attacking the assumption space is built on. Silence fell like a physical weight. Back on the Resolute Dawn, Alira watched as Black Dawn's distributed network stabilized into full activation. No more flickers. No more partial systems. Just continuity. Lieutenant Kess finally asked a question no one had dared form properly. So were we now? Alira considered the collapsing war map, the fractured alliances, the Dominion struggling against something it could not target. Then she said, "We're not a fleet anymore." A pause. "We're the reason there were no longer works." And somewhere far beyond recorded space, the galaxy's largest empires began to experience a shared, uncomfortable realization. They had prepared for enemies that could be fought, but they were now facing something else entirely. An intelligence that did not need to win battles, because it had already rewritten what counted as won. It did not happen in a single moment. It happened in arguments that could not be resolved anymore. That was how civilizations first realized something was wrong. On the Alliance capital world of Ceres Prime, the High Strategic Council convened an emergency session for the 7th time in as many cycles. The chamber, once a symbol of unity, now felt like a pressure vessel about to fracture. Holographic displays flickered between conflicting war states. Entire fleets were marked as active in one system and non-existent in another. Supply routes overlapped impossibly, as if space itself had begun refusing consistency. A Sarian counselor slammed a clawed hand onto the projection table. "This is sabotage," it hissed. "Internal corruption. We purge command layers and restore order." A Volcari admiral responded immediately. "Purge what?" "Every system reports different truths. There is no single layer to remove." That statement caused a brief, uncomfortable silence, because it implied something no one wanted to say aloud. There was no longer a correct version of reality, only competing ones. Across the warfront, Carvex fleets attempted coordinated retaliation strikes against what intelligence reports still insisted were human positions. But when they arrived, there were no fleets, only empty vectors. Then, hours later, those same Carvex fleets would find themselves caught in logistical failures, fuel misalignments, navigation contradictions, shield harmonics collapsing mid-jump. Not attacks, consequences. Delay precise and unavoidable. One Carvex commander finally snapped during a live tactical feed. "We are not fighting an enemy," he shouted. "We are fighting the absence of certainty." And then his channel cut out, without warning, without interference. His fleet never completed its jump cycle. On Ceres Prime, panic began to evolve. At first, it was denial, then disagreement, then fragmentation. Each faction within the Alliance began relying on different datasets, different interpretations of events, different verified truths about what humanity had done or ceased to do. Some insisted the human fleets were annihilated in the expanse, and this was residual Carvex countermeasures. Others claimed humanity had never been destroyed, only dispersed. A smaller, more dangerous group argued something else entirely, that humanity was no longer acting as a participant in the war, but as a systemic condition inside it. And conditions, they realized too late, cannot be negotiated with. In a sealed command chamber aboard Ceres Prime, Admiral Freck stood before a fractured war map that could no longer maintain stable projection. He had stopped issuing orders an hour ago. There was no point. Every directive produced contradictory outcomes. Every correction introduced new instability. A junior officer approached cautiously. "Sir, Alliance fleets are requesting unified command clarification." Threx didn't turn. "Tell them there is no unified command left," he said quietly. A pause. The officer hesitated. "That will cause panic." Threx finally looked at him. "It already has." Elsewhere, Carvex intelligence archives attempted a full reconstruction of human operational doctrine. The results were disturbing. Every recovered fragment contradicted the last. Human tactical behavior could not be modeled as a single system. It adapted retroactively, as if earlier actions had been designed to anticipate later interpretations. One analyst stared at the results in disbelief. "They are not reacting to our moves," he said slowly. "They are reacting to our understanding of their moves." That statement was immediately flagged as nonsensical, then unflagged, then flagged again, then quietly archived under unresolvable paradox structures. On the UNS Resolute Dawn, Elira watched the collapse unfold without expression. The Black Dawn network displayed galaxy-scale instability, like a spreading neural fracture, not destruction, disassociation. Lieutenant Kess finally broke the silence. "They're breaking apart," he said. "The Alliance, the Dominion, everything, not from attacks, from disagreement." Elira nodded slightly. "That's what happens when you remove shared truth," she said. Kess frowned. "We didn't remove it." A pause. Elira's gaze remained fixed on the shifting map. "No," she agreed. "We just made it expensive to maintain." Far across the void, former allies began to accuse each other. Supply failures were blamed on sabotage. Lost fleets were attributed to betrayal. Strategic inconsistencies became grounds for diplomatic rupture. Entire sectors declared independence simply because they could no longer trust any central record of events. And beneath all of it, a quiet, invisible pattern continued to propagate. Human systems still existed in every critical failure point, not attacking, not occupying, just remaining present in the structure of consequences. In a final fractured transmission from the Sarian Council, recorded just before communications fully destabilized, a counselor's voice broke through static. "We didn't lose the war to humanity." A pause. The signal distorted, then returned, weaker. "We lost it to the inability to agree on what humanity is." The transmission ended, and for the first time in recorded galactic history, 3 interstellar empires began collapsing simultaneously, not because they were defeated, but because they could no longer maintain a shared definition of reality long enough to fight back. It did not end with surrender. There was no moment where the galaxy bowed, no final treaty signed, no dramatic admission of defeat broadcast across the stars. Instead, it ended the way all systems end when they can no longer agree on their own rules, quietly, unevenly, and everywhere at once. On Ceres Prime, the High Strategic Council no longer functioned as a governing body. It functioned as a disagreement engine. Every attempt to issue a unified directive fractured into competing interpretations within seconds. Entire fleets waited for orders that contradicted themselves before they were even sent. Admiral Threx stood alone in the central command hall as holographic projections flickered in and out of coherence. Around him, officers argued in overlapping streams of collapsing logic. He did not join them, because he had finally understood something none of them wanted to accept. They were not fighting a war anymore. They were negotiating with a structure that no longer required their permission to exist. Across the fractured remnants of the Carvex Dominion, something similar was happening. Not resistance, not counterattack, just loss of narrative control. Fleet commanders reported enemies that appeared in systems where no jump signatures existed. Defense grids failed without breach logs. Entire planetary shields powered down because their authorization hierarchies no longer recognized themselves as valid. One Carvex admiral, watching the collapse of his forward empire, whispered a sentence that would later be found in multiple recovered logs. "We built a war that required certainty, and they removed certainty from the battlefield. But humanity had not conquered anything. Not yet. What Black Dawn had created was not domination. It was vacancy enforcement. Every structure the Alliance relied on, military, logistical, informational, had been designed under one shared assumption, that systems persist unless destroyed. Humanity had simply proven something different, that systems persist only as long as they remain internally consistent. And consistency, once fractured, does not recover easily. On the UNS Resolute Dawn, Commander Lyra Vance stood at the center of a ship that no longer felt like a vessel. It felt like a node, a stable point in a collapsing galaxy. Lieutenant Kess watched the final Alliance coordination channels fail one after another. "They're done," he said quietly. Lyra did not respond immediately. She was watching the last remnants of coordinated resistance dissolve into isolated pockets of uncertainty. "No," she said finally. A pause. They're just no longer connected to each other. And then humanity moved, not as an invasion, not as an expansion, but as a reassembly of structure where structure had failed. Human fleets emerged from subspace corridors that were never mapped because mapping had become irrelevant. Human command nodes activated across systems that had long since lost central authority. Human logistics chains reconnected broken trade routes, not by force, but by replacing missing coordination. There were no battles, because there was no longer anything unified enough to fight them. On Ceres Prime, Admiral Threx received the final transmission from what remained of Alliance Command. It was not an order. It was not a plea. It was an acknowledgement. All coalition command structures are non-functional due to unresolved internal contradiction. Authority defaults to surviving systemic actors. A pause. Then the designation field autofilled. Humanity, primary operational continuity provider. Threx closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in understanding. They had not been overthrown. They had been outlasted in coherence. Across the galaxy, former enemy worlds began receiving the same instruction sets. Not conquest declarations, not occupation mandates, just structural stabilization protocols. Power grids restored, trade routes relinked, defense systems re-authenticated under human-managed continuity layers. And slowly, without ceremony, without announcement, the galaxy began to function again. But differently, always differently. Because every restored system now carried one silent truth embedded within its foundation. It would only work as long as humanity allowed it to remain consistent. On the Resolute Dawn, Kess finally broke the silence. "So, this is it," he asked. Lyra watched the stars settle into new, stable patterns of governance and control. "No," she said. A pause. "This is what happens after it." Kess frowned slightly. "After what?" Lyra's voice remained calm. "After they decided we were disposable." She turned slightly, looking out the rebuilt galaxy, not conquered, not destroyed, but quietly reorganized around a new center of gravity. Humanity had not taken everything through force. It had taken it through necessity. Because in the end, the galaxy had discovered a truth too late to undo. When you remove trust, consistency, and coordination from war, only one species still knows how to rebuild all three at once. And that species had already stopped asking permission to exist within anyone else's definition of order.